The topic of this lecture is development. And I want to begin by showing you a movie, one you may have already seen before. It went viral quite a few years ago. And I like this video because it illustrates some central themes that we'll be talking about. It also gives you a chance to look at some real children and how they interact. And what you'll see here will tell you a little bit about morality, about good and evil, kinship, love, sadism, self-control, and most of all, humor.
Charlie bit me. Ah! Ah! Oh! Ouch! Ouch! Ouch, Charlie! Ow! Charlie, that really hurts. No, Charlie bit me. And that really hurt, Charlie, and it's still hurting.
Everything I talk about in intro psych, I find endlessly interesting, but I have to admit I find development more interesting in most topics. It's something that I've worked on all of my professional life. I continue to study development in my lab at Yale. And I think development and developmental psychology deals with foundational questions that have always puzzled us and that have tremendous intuitive interest. So one question concerns morality and the origin of moral thought. And you could imagine two very different views. One is that we start off as immoral, or at best, amoral. So you may think we're immoral because you accept the Christian doctrine of original sin, or the Freudian idea that we are ids, unrestrained appetites that need to be socialized. And so there's a view by scholars like Hobbes and Freud that we start off as animals, nasty and brutish. But there's also another view associated with scholars like Jean-Jacques Rousseau that suggests that we're basically good, and that what happens through culture is that we can be corrupted. And you see this, for instance, in people in contemporary discussions who talk about prejudice and racism, and they'll insist that we're not naturally prejudiced or racist. To the extent we become that way, it's because of the corrupting influence of culture. Children start off good, at least in that domain, and then sometimes society makes them worse. And we'll talk about research that explores these very questions later on in the course. And more generally, we're going to ask about the state of the art empirically on children's morality. A second question has to do with continuity. And what's the relationship between children and adults? So you see this handsome child here, and he grows up to be Albert Einstein. Or this child, who grows up to be a considerably worse adult, one of the worst of them all. And there's a lot of interest in the extent to which our adult natures, the extent to which the way we are right now was sort of set in stone, either when we were born because of our genes, or at least by the time we're 2 or 3. It's an interesting question, for instance, how much an interview with a 3-year-old can predict the way the 3-year-old would turn out. And it turns out that when studies are done, a 90-minute interview with a 3-year-old does predict personality on certain standard scales, the quality of their personal relationships, whether or not they have a job, criminal behavior, and so on. So to some extent, as the poetic phrase goes, the child is father to the man. A third question is the question of cognitive development, which is how much of what we know now we're born with, and how much we have to learn. And psychologists, developmental psychologists, talk about 3 different views. One is empiricism, which is we start off empty, and then we learn and learn and learn and learn. And you've seen this in the last lecture in discussions of behaviors, and this was the behaviorist idea. A second view is nativism, which is associated with Noam Chomsky, and this rejects the idea that learning plays a critical role and says we actually are born with rich, powerful, structured systems in our brain. And then there's a third view, constructivist. And the constructivist view is defended by Jean Piaget. And I'm going to talk about this in the next 2 sections, and you'll see that it shares with the empiricist view the idea that learning, interaction, dealing with the environment makes us what we are. But it shares with the nativist view the idea that the mind is actually quite complex, and the course of learning is not merely the accumulation of information, let alone the accumulation of conditioned responses, but rather something far more interesting and far more elegant.